Welcome back to Hardball. Well, the Supreme Court's decision to effectively demolish the Voting Rights Act yesterday has immediate effects that could disenfranchise all kinds of voters. In Texas, where the Voting Rights Act was implemented to prevent a photo ID requirement, the state's Republican Attorney General now says those days are over. In a statement, he said, quote, "With today's decision, the state's voter ID law will take effect immediately." In Mississippi, the same reaction. The state's Republican Secretary of State said, quote, "The process for implementation of constitutional voter identification begins today." And in Alabama, the Supreme Court's decision clears the way for that state's new photo ID law. The Alabama Secretary of State said, quote, "Photo voter ID will be the first process that we have gone through under this new ruling." Clearly, it's now become harder to vote in those states, and that's just beginning. Joining me now is Penn DeHare, co-director of the Advancement Project, and Washington Post columnist and MSNBC contributor Eugene Robinson. Gene, I want you to get in on this. You grew up in the Deep South. Here we go again. Voting Rights Act nullified, in this case by the Supreme Court. Its effectiveness, really. And here we have all these states that were playing these games back in 2011 and 2012 under the fine leadership of Republican leader Reince Priebus are now back at it again with no objection. Nobody an obstacle in terms of the Supreme Court or the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, what the court really has done, in my view, is take away the most effective weapon that the Justice Department had under the Voting Rights Act to keep states from doing this sort of thing, from doing voter suppression. Justice under Eric Holder has used preclearance to keep all sorts of bad things from happening. That's going to be harder now, and there are still other remedies under the Voting Rights Act, but much more difficult, I think, to prevent these sorts of voter suppression efforts.
Let me go to Penda. Penda, what happens now if a state is really egregious, like you got to have so much documentation, you just wear people out? They say, look, I'm 80 years old. I'm not going to get all my papers figured out again at this age. I'm not going to go to whatever office I got to go to. I'm not going to develop a paper trail. I've been voting all my life. People know me at the voting station. I'm just not going to bother. Does this wear voters out? Is this what this is about?
Chris, this is definitely an added burden for voters, especially for voters who, as you said, are older. It's also a burden for students. It's a burden for anybody that doesn't have a driver's license or a passport, which means people with lower incomes, less ability to move around and get to the driver's license authority. So what can happen is that either the Department of Justice or private groups such as Advancement Project on behalf of individuals in these states can sue under either state law or under the other section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which prohibits discrimination nationwide. But those lawsuits are expensive, and I think if you add all the resources of all the civil rights groups, there won't be nearly enough to do what the Department of Justice did, which is monitor thousands and thousands of voting changes every year.
To what effect? Oh, when they were able to act on the Voting Rights Act, that was more effective. Let's take a look at this one now, both of you. In North Carolina, the Supreme Court's decision has put booster rockets on a package of bills already passed by the House of Representatives that will make it much harder to vote. The state Senate intends to move as early as next week on them, quote, to require photo IDs at polls, eliminate same-day registration, cut early voting hours, including Sundays. Back to you, Penda. These seem to be areas. Early voting is a black phenomenon. I've been told that, and G knows that, and I'm just wondering, these seem so obviously targeted.
Yes, North Carolina is a state that has been known to be moderate, and I think it's a state, a southern state, where voters of color were starting to have a real impact. And this set of laws, especially the cutback on early voting and taking away Sunday voting, which is known as souls to the polls in the African American community, and then North Carolina's tremendous innovation of allowing registration during the early voting period. All of those mechanisms were used more heavily by African American voters, and in fact, President Obama carried North Carolina in 2008, not on Election Day, but during the early voting period.
Well, let me look at this, Gene. The only good news here is in the 2012 election, for the first time in Census history, black voter turnout passed that of whites in terms of percentages. 66.2 of eligible black voters cast ballots this past November. That's up from 64.7 in 2008. 64.1% of eligible non-Hispanic whites cast ballots. That's down from 66. So I think, you know, in terms of voters showing up, participation, at least in a presidential year when there is an African-American candidate for president, the black percentage of political activism has beaten the whites. This is the first. I'm not sure it's an enduring pattern, but it did happen for the first time.
And that's kind of the question, Chris. I mean, I think, and there's anecdotal evidence that I've picked up that all this voter suppression activity or these attempts actually helped motivate black voters in a lot of places, and who said, "Oh no, they're not going to do that to me," and brought people out to the polls. Big question as to whether in a midterm election, when you don't have the presidency at stake and when you don't have Barack Obama running on top of the ticket, can you get a black vote that exceeds or equals the percentage of white vote? But we'll see. I think that it'll be very interesting to see if this activism sustains. It has a John Henry quality, doesn't it? I mean, the guy against the machine, you know? I mean, how long can you fight the courts and keep winning? I hope they do. I hope you do. Thank you, Pendahare. Thank you, Gene, as always. It's tough times. We'll be right back after this.